Thank you. It's very exciting to be here in this new building, but today's discussion harkens back to one of Columbia's oldest traditions, its leadership over more than a century in the pursuit of justice and social change. Teachers College, which is just up the hill on Broadway, was founded in 1887 to train teachers of poor and immigrant children, and it's been at the forefront of public education ever since. Our School of Social Work, also founded in the late 19th century, played a role in crafting the Social Security Act and in shaping public policy on issues like foster care. Our public health school is a research and teaching powerhouse. And today, the quest for equality and fairness continues to flourish with Columbia's vast and deeply held commitment to advancing the cause of criminal justice reform. This issue has brought together departments, schools, and institutes from across the university, not just to study the problem, as the Academy is wont to do, but to actually begin to solve it. By last count, there were at least 30 different justice initiatives underway at Columbia. We have educational programs for people while they are in prison. Through the Center for Justice, Columbia instructors have been teaching at Rikers, Sing Sing, Bedford Hills, and Taconic since the summer of 2015, and these courses are fully transferable for college credit. We have educational programs for people when they are released. Our first cohort of justice and education scholars entered in summer of 2015, and now 39 scholars have completed at least one class, while 10 have completed more than one, and one has completed her studies. Our Business School's Tamer Center develops solutions for post-incarceration employment, and that starts right here on campus, where formerly incarcerated people are our colleagues, bosses, and teachers. Columbia has also become a hub for academic work in justice issues, recruiting faculty like Bruce Western, a leading expert in mass incarceration, who joined us from Harvard last year. Today, we consider another issue at the heart of criminal justice reform movement, prison labor and the 13th Amendment. No great quest for change is complete without a complicated constitutional question at the heart of it. And that's what our panel will explore today. So let me introduce you to them. Kendall Thomas is the professor, the Nash Professor of Law and the director of the Center for the Study of Law and Culture at Columbia University. As one of the originators of this campaign and a constitutional scholar, he will discuss the exception clause itself, as well as the process of amending the 13th Amendment. Sheena Wright is president and CEO of the United Way of New York City and is a graduate of Columbia College and Columbia Law School. She will expand on the United Way's literacy campaign and the historical connection of literacy to slavery, emancipation, and the contemporary carceral state. Mikhail DeVoe is the founder of Citizens Against Recidivism and a lecturer at Nassau Community College. He served 25 years in prison and since his release in 2003 has dedicated his research and activism to helping the formerly incarcerated with a major focus on amending the exception clause. And Flores Forbes, my colleague in the Department of Government and Community Affairs at Columbia, he's the vice president there, will begin the discussion with remarks about his 2016 book, Invisible Men, a contemporary slave narrative in the era of mass incarceration, which discusses the 13th Amendment, Black men returning to society after prison, and the framing of the exception clause by Thomas Jefferson. Flores is also formerly incarcerated. Have a wonderful afternoon discussion. Thank you. Okay, take care.
All right, great. It's great everybody's here. And before I get started, I think on the screen you can see some of the sponsors from the university that were part of the pulling all this together. And so I specifically want to congratulate and let you know about Government and Community Affairs staff. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to pull this together. So there's a few people. It's Maggie Barrow, Erica Lagunier, Annette Ralph, and Bashar McKay. So they were very, very helpful in making all this happen. So, we are here to discuss the 13th Amendment, which was proposed, ratified in 1865 We are also here to educate ourselves about its origin, its complexity, and the consequences, and to have a discussion on how we should move forward to amend the exception clause. There's a Professor William Carter, who's a professor of law and one of the foremost experts in the 13th Amendment. He says, in short, because the insinuation of slavery was about the interaction of race, power, and group status, the 13th Amendment should be expressly construed in terms of race, power, and group status. So today we're going to be talking about race in America. We're going to be talking about literacy and education and how it was used as a weapon against the enslaved and how it is being used today to measure demand for the carceral state. We'll be discussing the U.S. Constitution and American public policy that was created, discussed, and framed by white supremacists who wore the cloak of so-called democratic policymakers. And we will also discuss the 13th Amendment's exception clause and all of its negative externalities, like convict leasing, the black codes, Jim Crow, and the emergence of hyper-incarceration. And we will also talk about the architect of the exception clause, and that's Thomas Jefferson. So I want to discuss this in a personal way because this is my connection to the exception clause of the 13th Amendment. Back in the day, I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't know what it was when I was in prison. I was in prison in California. I did 6 to 8 years in the California Department of Corrections for felony murder. Now, not only did I know nothing about it, when I was impacted by it, what did it affect? Well, it affects education and it affects work. In California, if you work a week, every day you work, you get a day off. Every day you go to school, you get a day off. So I was in the college program at Soledad State Prison, and one day my counselor told me I needed to sign some paperwork for my Pell Grant. The document I had to sign was a power of attorney. So when I asked, well, why do I have to sign this? She basically said, you're not a person. You are C72851. And that's because of the exception clause. Now, I was transferred to San Quentin after a year, and at the same time, there was no education programming, it was just work. Prison was on a general lockdown because a guard had been killed, so they were bringing people in to keep their furniture factory going. I made chairs for 15 cents an hour. The total cost of labor and material for each chair was $75. The chairs were sold to the state of California, to the University of California, California State Universities, to state, county, and local agencies for $300 to $400 a chair. And that's basically slave labor. And this is confirmed by the 13th Amendment's exception clause. So right now, there are currently 70 factories in California's 33 prisons. And one of the things that I witnessed is that they have a slave labor operation that's totally self-sufficient. They had farms, they had fisheries, they had ranches, they had clothing and shoe factories, all manned by inmate slaves being paid 15 cents an hour. So it's no surprise that when the inmates of several state prisons, it's commonly called Black August, and it begins August 21st, which was the day George Jackson was killed, and it ends September 9th, which was the beginning of the Attica Rebellion. So the strike was going on, and basically what happened because of the strike, the state of California was losing $600,000 a day. Now, the CDC Industries brings in $207 million in revenues and $60 million in profit. So each inmate that is being paid less than $2 a day generates annually for the state of California $41,540. So they're basically breaking even because tax levy dollars are used to pay for the incarcerated inmate. So the author of the final version of the 13th Amendment was Senator John Henderson of Missouri. He was a slaveholder up until the Civil War began. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner was a leading opposition to this final version and offered another version that did not include what he saw as a loophole to reestablish slavery by another name, the exception clause. However, if we use history's text to explore the loophole that created today's carceral state, I think we can firmly detect that a loophole does not exist where there is original intent. Now, even though the 13th Amendment and the exception clause was put forth in 1865, the original exception clause was created by Thomas Jefferson in 1784. And he wrote letters, he wrote documents, and in many ways they're almost like 18th, 19th century emails. This guy was talking about all this stuff, and he was pretty clear. And many of the other slaveholders and the policymakers were clear also that their biggest fear was emancipation. So the first time the exception clause related to slavery appeared in the American narrative in 1784, it was a draft that Thomas Jefferson was writing that was supposed to provide guidelines for governing of the western states. And it read that after the year 1800 of the Christian era, there should be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in any of the said states, otherwise than in punishment of crimes, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted and to have been personally guilty. So, he also wrote a letter to Albert Gallatin about the Missouri Compromise. And this was another kind of a spin on an exception clause where there was no crime. He said, my proposition would be that the holders should give up all born after a certain day, past, present, or to come, that these should be placed under guardianship of the state and sent at a proper age to Santo Domingo, which is Haiti. And, but probably the most chilling aspect of the letters of Thomas Jefferson to his colleagues was a letter that was entitled "The Fire Bell in the Night." And the kind of backstory is that he woke up in a cold sweat, and he realized that someday we're going to have to let them go. So this is an excerpt from that letter. And he says, a general emancipation and expatriation could be effected, and gradually and with due sacrifices, I think it might be. But as it is, we have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation is in the other. So in addition to this, he experimented on his farm Monticello, or plantation. He had a nail factory, and he was looking at the relationship between slave plantations and prisons as places that held unfree people living under the control of others. So today, you have Angola in Louisiana, Parchman in Mississippi, and Cummings in Arkansas. These are all modern-day prisons that were formerly slave plantations. So because the framers of the 13th Amendment had access to the Thomas Jefferson letters and documents, and even adopted the language of Thomas Jefferson in the draft, I am proposing that it is a strong signal that would lead one to believe that the intent of controlling black bodies post-emancipation was paramount behind the insertion of the exception clause. And so to kind of close, I want to refer to a case that was in 1871 in the Virginia Supreme Court. And it was a Justice J. Christian. And the case was Ruffin versus Commonwealth. And he basically says he has, as a consequence of his crime, not only forfeited his liberty, but all his personal rights except those which the law in its humanity accord him. He is for the time being the slave of the state. Okay, I'm gonna stop there, and I'm going to introduce Sheena Wright, who, we worked together with real estate developers, community developers in Harlem, and we were having a meeting with a African-American woman who was an investment banker. And she told us that they used the third grade test scores of black boys in their regression models in order to predict the number of prison beds that they would be able to finance with municipal bonds. So anyway, here's Sheena Wright.
Thank you so much, Flores. It does certainly feel like a homecoming. Work with Flores, Mikael, work with us as well as a researcher, and Kendall was my professor at Columbia Law School, critical race theory. So this is such a timely and important conversation, and I'm so happy to be a part of it. Is this the clicker? Yes, okay, let's see. All right, wonderful, I got it. What Flora certainly shared with us is so incredibly sobering and grounding. I wanted to start my part of the discussion with the quote from Frederick Douglass. And for, I think, all of us who are descendants of African people who were enslaved in this country, the concept of education as liberation, and learning to read in particular as a threat to the things that Flores talked about, race, power, and group status, is very real for us. Once you learn to read, you will forever be free. We know the story of Frederick Douglass and the fact that he was forbidden to learn to read. He was beaten viciously, and when he was able to gain his education and his freedom, there was a dramatic change in his life, obviously. Let's see, here we go. So as Flora said, we did, in fact, although every state will tell you that we absolutely do not use third grade test scores to predict prison beds. But as we know, people who finance the prison beds absolutely do. When you're trying to determine municipal bond pricing, and you look at these factors, and there's a lot of correlation between the two. Third graders who can read proficiently are 74% more likely, are 70% less likely to graduate from high school. There's a little typo. And we know that 1 in every 10 young men male dropout is in jail or in juvenile detention, 1 in every 10. 85% of all juveniles who interface with the juvenile court system are functionally low literate, and 70% of all incarcerated adults cannot read at a 4th grade level. This is a quote from the Department of Justice. The link between academic failure and delinquency, violence, and crime is welded to reading failure. This is a report that they issued in 1993, and the report was entitled Reduced Recidivism and Increased Employment Opportunity Through Research-Based Reading Instruction. They're inextricably linked. So here's another look at today. If we look at the correlation rate between third grade reading proficiency and incarceration, there are 32 school districts in the city of New York. As we all know, I think in this room, and there's been a lot of focus on it in the media, they are highly segregated school districts. The ones that have the most percentages of Black and Hispanic students have the lowest levels of reading proficiency by 3rd grade. If you look at the Bronx, for example, District 7, not that far away, 28% of children are reading on grade level by 3rd grade. If you look at District 5, which we're sitting in right now in Harlem, that number is 29%. This is also an interesting fact. The Justice Atlas, and this is also a product of Columbia. I think I don't even know when it was, but several years ago, one of the schools at Columbia did a report entitled The $1 Million Blocks. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but they looked at that there were 7 neighborhoods in the city of New York that, and out of those 7 neighborhoods, comprised 70% of the prison population in the state. And they looked at the kind of investment, the cost of incarcerating all of those individuals, and they were in the millions upon millions of dollars. So if you look at, District 7, which is what this map highlights, you'll see the very, very dark red on the map, some of the highest percentages of people who are incarcerated in New York City live in those same communities that have the lowest proficiency rates for 3rd grade reading. So why is that? What are some of the drivers? I mean, Flores, I think, laid it out for us, and I had to kind of key into Thomas Jefferson as well. He was the framers of many things, one of the big architects of our modern education system as well. And the first statement is my own. And based on all of my education at Columbia, I certainly appreciate that the purpose of education in the United States has been to prepare its populace for future work and productivity and to maintain distinct social and economic class structures. So Thomas Jefferson said that the mass of our citizens may be divided into 2 classes. And he was talking about white people. This was in 1779, right. The laboring and the learned. The laboring will just need the 1st grade of education so that they can do what we need them to do. And the learned will need it as a foundation for their future acquirements. So our educational system is designed to make sure that we are targeting and funneling people by class and certainly by race into certain socioeconomic structures and systems. So how does that show up today? Another Columbia study and involvement was around the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. It was a lawsuit that was filed in 1994 against the state of New York. And the New York State Court of Appeals, the highest court in the state, declared that the state was violating the Constitution in its funding to New York City schools, and basically ensuring that all children did not have the opportunity for a sound basic education. That lawsuit was in 1995. The state still, today, to this day, has not given schools in New York City, in low-income communities, the fair student funding that they deserve. So if you look at this District 7, this is a constellation of schools. Some schools are underfunded as much as $600,000. It ranges. And what you also will know that these are obviously the schools that have the highest concentration of students in homeless shelters and poverty. They have the lowest, the teachers that have the lowest certifications or highest teacher turnover rate, and they're underfunded just as a baseline. So these schools have an underfunding just in this district of about $31 million. And if we go back to that chart that shows us the amount of money that we are spending to incarcerate people in those very same school district, it's $56.4 million. So that's where we are today, and certainly one of the solutions certainly is to disrupt that system, to ensure that that our children receive the opportunities and the resources that they need in order to be successful. So one of the things that United Way of New York City launched in 2013 was a campaign for grade level reading. We're a part of a national campaign. The Casey Foundation in 2010 released a report that just showed all the data we just talked about. You're 74% more likely to drop out of high school. This is a crisis situation. Low-income children around the country are not meeting this critical benchmark, and it's obviously determining their future. So we are the manifestation of that national campaign here in New York City. And we need to leverage the assets of the whole community, corporate government and foundations, working in community with parents, teachers, and others. And so we've been doing it in that same neighborhood in Mott Haven that I showed you, which is also one of the highest crime neighborhoods in the country. And in 5 years, we started in 2013, 9.4% of kids, 9.4% of kids were reading on grade level by 3rd grade across 6 schools. And of the most recent test, 43% were reading on grade level. And certainly we know we can continue to improve those numbers. So that kind of gives you a sense of literacy and the impact and the direct correlation to mass incarceration, as well as Flores really ably kind of laid out. It is by design, and that design is to you. All right, right on.
Okay, next I want to bring up Dr. Mikhail DeVoe. And now, is anybody here, if you're familiar with his organization, Citizens Against Recidivism, it's a, right on, yeah. It's a organization he founded while he was still incarcerated. And every year, when is it, August? October 26th, he has an award ceremony where he gives awards to formerly incarcerated people who have achieved, fantastic, just they're milestones. They've just reached different milestones. Some of it with education, some of it with service, and he even gives out Lifetime Achievement Awards. I think this year we're going to give it out to Jamal Joseph. Oh, excuse me. And anyway, here's Mikhail DeVoe.
So thank you very much, Flores, for that introduction. And we also want to thank Nashina Wright and Mr. Kendall Thomas for their contribution to my education and experience since we've met. But I also want to thank the folk here at Columbia for allowing us to host this event and this conversation. As already been said, my name is Mikhail DeVoe, and I usually do not reference any of the number of credentials that I possess to preference any of my conversations, primarily because I don't think it's actually necessary. But I wanted it to be known and clear about the extent of my relationship, both personally and professionally, as we begin this conversation. And so by show of hands, how many of you out there support the institution of slavery? By show of hands. You got to ask. Let me ask another question. By show of hands, how many people are in full support of the Constitution of the United States? This is about being honest. How many people out there support the Constitution of the United States? Raise your hand. All right, now we're getting somewhere, because those same hands should have been raised when we talked about supporting the institution of slavery. And this is not a small point, primarily because the Constitution or the law, it functions primarily for the benefit of its citizens. And if we consider ourselves citizens, and this law that we are having a discussion about is something that we support, then we are supporting every aspect of the law which governs our lives. And so I learned about my relationship to the 13th Amendment during the 32 years of time when I was under correctional supervision. 25 of those years I spent actually in prison as a slave of the state, and now as an ex-slave of the state because of my literal reading of the Constitution, because of my literal interpretation of this particular amendment. I was indeed, and I found no other way to classify myself, a slave of the state. And it was there that I saw a much broader understanding of my situation, sort of following the George Jackson model of education, the Hajj Malik, Malcolm X model of education, where people in prison, some people in prison began to reflect on their current context and sought to gain a better understanding. And what became clear then and what is clear now is that the passing of the amendment in its present form had some but not all of the expected impact for African Americans. There was something that we anticipated following its passage, and it's coincidental that Sheena and I both referenced Frederick Douglass because, for me, Frederick is a hero. And he was one of the persons that I looked to for an example of having the first belief and then the will to reconstruct reality, even though one found themselves in the situation that they themselves had not constructed. And so Frederick Douglass, who was more contemporaneously closer to the issue, declared that the 13th Amendment was just the beginning of something. And when I look at the 13th Amendment, I look at it as the beginning of work that is yet unfinished. And Fred, quote, said, "Verily, the work does not end with the abolition of slavery, as stated in the 13th Amendment only begins." And some of us who are American citizens, all of us here, should think about the meaning of what it is that Fred was talking about, because the conditions that he articulated still exist. And he said that so long as there were white oppressors, so long as white oppressors retained in their hands power to exclude people of African descent from political rights, they could reduce them to a condition similar to slavery. And this is Fred talking in 1865, May of 1865. They would not call it slavery, but some other name. Slavery had been fruitful in giving itself names. It had been called the peculiar institution. It had been called the social system. It had been called the impediment. It had been called so many names, great many names. Perhaps we might think of another name, immigration detention, as a new name or a new iteration of this social phenomenon. And as you could see with the passage of time, we continue to wait for different iterations of this monster and trying to figure out what other shape it would assume, what new skin this old snake would come forth with. But this is Fred in 1865. I'm just reiterating some of the statements that he made. And so we, in our history, have already seen the number of overt iterations of this form, in the form of convict leasing, in the form of chain gangs, in the form of peonage, in the form of sharecropping. We've seen this before. We also note that, as some would argue, the 13th Amendment was primarily deployed against all of the badges and incidents of slavery. And we're still trying to figure out, at least in my mind, some of us are trying to figure out what does that exactly mean. But among the things that is clear that some of the proponents of this amendment sought was an end to a discriminatory system manifested in the black codes, which were directly designed to further enslave blacks by establishing a legal basis for neo-slavery. The black codes were a reconfigured judicial system that included discriminatory laws that would apply primarily to black men only. The intention behind these laws was to criminalize blacks so they could be re-enslaved under a legal system. Sheriffs, deputies, and some court officials derived most of their compensation from fees charged to black people convicted of crimes for each step in their own arrest, conviction, shipment to a private prison. Think of, I think it's Ferguson, wherein people in that particular town were burdened with all kinds of fees that they did not have money to pay, parking fees and all kinds of tickets, and just a way of further dragging people into the system that they could not pay. Of course, they were incarcerated. However, the expectation of some was that all the badges and incidents of slavery would be obliterated. This is, what we're thinking that would the 13th Amendment meant. One of the early proponents, Senator Henry Wilson, argued that everything connected with or pertained to it, including the sacred rights of human nature. We would recall that during this time, people of color, particularly African descent, were not even considered human beings. If we understand chattel slavery, you understand that people were things and objects and property. And so among the things that were expected was an acknowledgement of the humanness of the black person, the hallowed relationship of husband and wife. We know during this time that people could not be married unless the slave master permitted the union. We know that, and this is still taking place today, parents and children were, the relationship between parents and children was sacred. We continue to see a separation of parents and children today on our southern borders, reminiscent of the same time period when parents could not protect their children. They were just snatched from them because they could. And so there are a lot of things that are related to the passage of this particular bill that was expected. But if we take in consideration, what is taking place in our own lives, we'll see that there's still bans on practices wherein minoritized contractors are forbidden from engaging in for their economic gain. We still see admission policies that exclude minoritized groups from select colleges and universities. There's currently a movement in some of the schools' admission process to ban the box, wherein people should not have to mention past incarceration as part of the criteria for their admission. We still see, all types of electoral practices, the Electoral College in particular, which was established to maintain remnants of this system. Voter laws, which could see all kinds of effort to exclude, people of minoritized groups from participating in the franchise. We also see that there was an expectation that Confederate battle flags would no longer be flown. There was also the expectation that the killing of unarmed black men would not take place. And we still see the manifestations of these things in this day and time. There was an expectation of equal citizenship. And of course, there's conversation about what does it mean to be a citizen. Well, we know that a slave is not a citizen. Is an ex-slave a citizen? Because at the time that these laws were developed, the Constitution, remember, they were not talking about people of African descent. And so instead, we have another iteration in today's hyper-incarceration of people of color, similar politics, similar law enforcement apparatuses in that which establishes the neo-slavery of today. We also see the participation of a myriad of companies that are exploiting and take advantage of people while they're in prison, taking advantage of their labor. We have heard that there are people that are in prison that are let out to fight forest fires in California for $2 a day. I mean, just to get outside of the prison, they risk their lives for $2 a day to fight forest fires. Interesting. And so we continue to see the targeting of people of color. These are just statistics wherein there's a comparison of the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for a U.S. resident by race. And in addition to that, in the land of the free, there are more people in prison per 100,000 than any other country in the world. In the land of the free. China, Russia, all the places that we have in our minds been, or perhaps not in our minds, but have been taught to believe are more totalitarian and oppressive in nature than the United States, then how is it in the land of the free? 1 out of every 5 or 4 people that are in a jail or prison in the world are incarcerated in the land of the free. And so there are a host of manifestations of this 13th Amendment in today's day. It includes, of course, the shackling of pregnant women in prison during labor and childbirth. Of course, there have been some efforts to undo or develop, anti-shackling law, anti-shackling movement to address this issue, but it primarily comes from the persistent practice attached to black women in particular to their historical devaluation, to their historical conceptualization of being insignificant as being things. And this is where the practice originates. And so they too are being punished. Their reproductive capacity is being punished. And we've seen again wherein there's always, or there not is always, but there's this question: to what extent can people control themselves? Oh, so you've seen this before. All right. Well, you know, some things are just too frequent to be coincidental. You know, I know gangs throw signs, and you know, gangs and organizations, there's very little difference between the two, because gangs are basically organized people, and we just don't call some gangs gangs, but they throw signs. And then throwing the same signs, if we look at the same policies, we see that it is, or they have been developed in furtherance of notions of white supremacy. And we know that notions of white supremacy or notions of whiteness are predicated upon black inferiority. And so the trend continues. And so, more the same, we hear this in our politics today, America first, and the real meaning of that is not new. There was a group, American terrorist group named the Ku Klux Klan, who also made that same claim. These are just some of their newspapers that have been tucked in the corner in the library. But they're there. This too is a part of the past. And so among the things that frame my thinking is this framework that I learned at the Silverman School of Social Work. I think I want to give my school a little shout out, even though we're in Columbia. And this particular approach is called the just practice approach. And it's a framework consisting of 5 components: meaning, wherein, you know, in every situation we should engage in an examination of what does this actually mean. Because in all the things in our relationships, we assign some type of interpretation. Context. We need to see, you know, the situation in context. But we cannot understand context unless we understand the story of the past, which some people frame as history. Because we can't understand where we are unless we understand how did we get there. Finally, we need to understand relationships of power. And this is why we made mention of white supremacy. Because often we don't include in our analysis power dynamics, and finally, possibility. I could not be here if we were not hopeful. Among the reasons that we have conditions that remain as they are, because we tell ourselves, this is the way it is, this is the way it's always been, this is the way it always will be. Well, I don't tell myself that. I think what is possible, which is the last of the frameworks, you know, the last of the components. And so, you know, one of the things we hope to have is a discussion about what are we going to do? As we heard, I think one of the people related to the school, we're not here just to identify problems. We've seen this before. You know, we've been, what's this, 1619 to 2019? That's 400 years, as Hajj Malik said. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. Oh, you remember that? And so I just want to conclude with, you know, just throwing some questions out about what's possible. What role, what activities, you know, can we engage in to right this terrible wrong that is perpetuated, not just upon, as Flores and Sheena said, it's not just black people. It began with us, but we need to think clearly about issues related to class. And hyper-incarceration brings that to the fore: class, race, and place, as Sheena also made mention. And with that, I'll bring on a person who I've grown to admire. And I'd like all of us to give Kendall Thomas a round of applause because it's his birthday.
Oops, so you embarrassed me. This is a clicker. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many people in the room. I'm going to try to do what I will. Sheena. There we go. So I'm going to Can you go back? Yes, there we are. It's wonderful to see so many folks in the room. I think it's important to say at the outset that our purpose for gathering here this afternoon is not merely to have a conversation, although you have been offered a panoramic perspective by the three of my friends and colleagues who have already spoken. In many ways, I have the easiest job of everyone on the panel because I simply have to make a point here and a point there to connect some of the dots of the fine presentations that you've heard. Now, Flores is going to get upset with me because I'm going to depart from my brief. It is true that I am the only law professor on the panel, although I'm not, as Sheena told you, the only one on the panel who has studied law formally. But I feel very strongly, not just as a legal academic, but as a critical race theorist, that the insight that Flores Forbes mentioned at the outset of his presentation from the work of Dean William Carter of the University of Pennsylvania Law School could not be more correct about the centrality of race in understanding the 13th Amendment and in understanding the puzzling persistence of slavery in the institution of coerced prison labor. So it is absolutely crucial that we think of the state that could enact a constitution that would simultaneously abolish slavery and yet retain slavery as a racial state, and that we think of that constitution as a racial constitution. And I say that even as one of the persons in the audience who had to hold my hand down when Dr. DeVoe asked how many of us supported the Constitution, because there is a part of me which, and I want to be honest, would be lying if I said that, not simply by virtue of my training, but by virtue of the fact that we can make rights claims today that our ancestors could not make, that the US Constitution was, in the history of political rights and freedoms, an achievement, even though the gap between what it claimed to be and what it has been in fact for people of color and poor people in this country, not to mention peoples around the world, does not even begin to live up to so many of its ideals. So what I'd like to do then is, as a lawyer, to give you one reason why I believe that the movement that we hope this discussion will be a part of to amend the 13th Amendment ought not lead with law, or ought to understand the specific legal goal of changing the 13th Amendment to eliminate the exceptions clause as simply a tool to a larger end, which has to do not simply with constitutional rights, but with the more profound and in many ways elusive goal of democratic justice, of a democratic justice which I want to suggest to you is not only about racial justice, but is also about economic justice. So, some facts by way of a review. In the United States today, 2.3 million people are incarcerated, which is a 500% increase over the last 40 years. My topic is the 13th Amendment. these two slides should have been first. People of color account for 37% of the US population, yet they represent 67% of the prison population. So 64% of the population identifies as white, 30% of the people in state and federal prisons are white, 12% of the population identifies as black, 33% of the prison and jail population in the United States is black, 16% of the population identifies as Latino or Latina, 23% of persons in prisons and jails today are Latino or Latina. Black men are nearly 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men, and federal courts imposed prison sentences on black men that were 19% longer than those imposed on similarly situated white men between 2001, I think that probably is, I apologize for the typo, and 2016. Meanwhile, Latino men are more than twice as likely to be incarcerated as non-Latino white men and face sentences 5% longer than white counterparts. US prisons and jails now house the largest female prisoner population on Earth. Over 219,000 women are currently serving sentences, and this number continues to grow each year. Between 1980 and 2014, the number of women in US jails and prisons increased more than 700%, almost twice the rate, another typo, of men. 36% of women in the US identify as women of color, but make up nearly 50% of the female prison population. African American women are 3 times more likely to be in prison than white women, and Latina women are 60% more likely to be imprisoned. Right. Now, we could talk about this central social fact of the prison industrial complex in the United States and hyperincarceration as a problem fundamentally of rights, of the deprivation or the abuse of people through law and the denial of legal rights. But I want to suggest an alternative frame, and it is a frame which comes to us from the work of our late beloved colleague, Manning Marable, who founded and was the first director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies here at Columbia. In 1983, Manning published a path-breaking book entitled How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. The book was inspired in large part by the extraordinary work of the Ghanaian scholar Walter Rodney, who in 1972 published a book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And using the theoretical frame that Walter Rodney developed in 1972, Manning Marable sought to bring to bear on African American life an analysis of the condition of black people in the United States as a problem that was not first and foremost about rights, law, politics, but was fundamentally about development, economic development. Let me read to you an extended quotation from the opening pages of that magisterial work of scholarship. Afro-Americans, wrote Marable, have been on the other side of one of the most remarkable and rapid accumulations of capital seen anywhere in human history. The relationship is filled with paradoxes. Each advance in white freedom was purchased by black enslavement. White affluence coexists with black poverty. White state and corporate power is the product in part of black powerlessness. Income mobility for the few is rooted in income stasis for the many. White society in America has systematically excluded blacks as a group from the material, cultural, and political gains achieved by other ethnic minorities. Blacks are unemployed, economically exploited, and politically disenfranchised because they are excluded or segregated because of caste or racial discrimination. Oops. But there's another point of view on this issue. Blacks occupy the lowest rung in the ladder of American upward mobility precisely because they have been integrated all too well into the system. America's democratic government and free enterprise system are structured deliberately and specifically to maximize black oppression. Capitalist development has occurred not in spite of the exclusion of blacks, but because of the brutal exploitation of blacks as workers and consumers. Blacks have never been equal partners in the American social contract because the system exists not to develop, but to underdevelop black people. The system exists not to develop, but to underdevelop black people. So what does it mean to think about the problem of prison slavery in the terms offered to us by Manning Marable? The central point I want to make in my brief remarks is that in thinking about developing an analysis and a discourse and a national conversation around the injustices of prison slavery, we need to shift from the civil rights or constitutional rights model that sees the essential racial injustice of prison slavery as a problem of discrimination, right, to an understanding of the ways in which the injustice of prison slavery has to be located first and foremost in the way in which it operates as a motor of economic underdevelopment. It's not just an injury to the individuals who are forced, as my Uncle Paul, who called me this morning, it was my first birthday call, he called me from California, and I asked him, Paul, he's like my baby brother, his younger uncle. Paul, which prison were you in? He was a casualty of the so-called war on drugs, which we all know was in fact a war on black people. Which prison were you in? He said, I was in Folsom. And I said, did you work while you were there? Yeah, he said, I worked for the PIA, the Prison Industries of America. I said, well, what did you do, Paul? He said, I made chairs and I made tables. I said, how much did they pay you, Paul? He said, about 60 cents. They paid me good. I said, Paul, would you make 60 cents now if you worked? No, I wouldn't. But that's part of the ideological obscenity of prison labor, that we actually persuade the people whose labor we're exploiting that they're doing something for which they should be grateful. And their families very often feel, well, at least he's making money, right, in the prison that he can send home. So that's part of the ideological obscenity of this system that occludes an understanding of the ways in which this is about the economic development, underdevelopment of a community. So think about felon disenfranchisement and the laws which many states have adopted to deny people the right to vote, either for a limited period of time or in some states for the rest of their lives, a kind of civic death if you are convicted of a crime. Well, the impact of those laws are a double harm, right? They mean civic death not only for the people who can no longer vote, but they weaken the political power of the already vulnerable civic publics to which those people belong, right? So alongside the political underdevelopment of laws like that results from laws like felon disenfranchisement, certainly when combined with other measures of voter suppression, right? We see economic underdevelopment. So I think it's very important to connect and to engage in a connectional analysis and understanding of the exploitation of black labor that is going on in prisons, and to connect that to the exploitation and underdevelopment, economic underdevelopment of black communities that is occurring outside. I would think here of the million dollar blocks phenomenon. So, we have to, in other words, connect the absence of true racial democracy in this country, right, with the violence and the exploitation of black labor that is racial capitalism in this country. So the development of racial capitalism, I want to suggest to you, requires, right, the underdevelopment of black democracy. The two are intimately connected. So we might think, to borrow a phrase by the late great Afro-British cultural theorist Stuart Hall, in terms of the fateful triangle of US racism, which has three pillars: economic, legal and political, and sociocultural. And we want to situate what I've been calling, following Manning Marable, the underdevelopment of black America by racial capitalism, US racial capitalism, as a pillar in the house of US racism. Now, just a word about the specifics of Article 5. This is the constitutional template on which we must rely in seeking a change at the federal level in the language of the 13th Amendment. There are similar state provisions. Some of you may have heard about the successful campaign in Colorado to abolish an exceptions clause in that state's constitution. But this is the process that we will have to go through to change the 13th Amendment. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or, on the application of the legislature of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention, a national convention, for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the states or by conventions in 3/4 of the states, as the one or other mode of ratification may be proposed by Congress, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article. I included that language simply to indicate to you how thoroughly saturated, or the extent to which racism and specifically slavery is secreted in the interstices of the text of the US Constitution, because that oblique reference in that clause to the first clause of the 9th section of the first article is a reference to the provision in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, the first provision, which forbids the federal government from enacting any law whatsoever that shall affect what the Constitution refers to rather euphemistically as the migration of such persons, right, as shall be granted admission to the United States, that is to say slaves, right, before the year 1808. So even in the amendment setting up the architecture for, the article setting up the architecture for amending the Constitution, the framers of the Constitution, who I learned when I was in 5th grade, my birthday, by the way, I share my birthday with George Washington. The framers of the Constitution included a clause in the provision of the Constitution that's about amending it, which forbids amending that foundational clause that established slavery. Although we know even after 1808, at least 50,000 Africans were illegally brought into the US as slaves. Right? So that's the technical language that we must follow. But we need to realize, as I said at the outset, that this legal change is part of a social movement. Right? So the abolition of prison slavery is part of a broader social movement to abolish the prison industrial complex as we know it. The work we started here, then, has to be seen as the first in a 3-stage process. This is work in which we're all engaged, we're all activists here, of cultural preparation and organization. We are acquiring, to use Sheena's framework, the literacy that we will need to talk to our neighbors, our friends, sometimes even members of our families, to explain why prison slavery and the abolition of prison slavery ought to be one of the most urgent tasks on the agenda of anybody in this country who is truly committed to making the promises of the Constitution real for for each and every American. Right? And from that work of creating cultural literacy, cultural preparation, and organization, we can then build public support for changing the Constitution, the language of the Constitution in the 13th Amendment. This is not going to be easy work, but I'm hoping that we might draw on one model, which is the model given to us by the good people of the great city of Jackson, Mississippi, where the late Chokwe Lumumba created a really innovative form of public and civic engagement called the People's Assemblies, in which ordinary citizens generated ideas for public policy, which were presented to elected officials and then enacted as policy. I was in a conversation here at Columbia a couple of weeks ago with the young mayor of Jackson, Chokwe Lumumba, the son of the late Chokwe Lumumba. He said, when I ran for mayor, I told folks that when I'm elected mayor, you're going to be mayor. Right? And this practice of the People's Assemblies, I think, is a model on which we might draw in creating, through a non-governmental politics, a constituency for the amendment of the 13th Amendment to get rid of this awful language, which has normalized and naturalized and made seem completely unexceptional one of the most obscene institutions in the history of human rights violation, prison slavery. I invite you all to join in this process of acquiring and sharing literacy. Black labor matters, but it will never matter so long as we accept, without resistance, a state of affairs in which people can be forced to work simply because they've been convicted of a crime. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
You know, I thought you were going to wrap up with that on the other side, but anyways, what you just said, I thought you were going to do like a summary later on, but I do have a question that I want to pose to the panel before we open it up for questions to the audience, and it's with regards to economics. Okay, the Center for Economic and Policy Research produced a study. It's called The Price We Pay, the economic costs of barriers to employment for former prisoners and people convicted of felonies. And so basically their findings are that because these over 70 million people who are formerly incarcerated or justice involved that are not in prison, that are in this country, I think it's probably higher than 70 or that number, right? That because they're not fully engaged in the economy, the gross domestic product is losing every single year $100 billion. Okay? So the question is that, does this mean we need to consider some sort of a capital investment, which is, I guess, my term for reparations, to fill the historical and human capital gap? So we can do that right quick and see if...
So, to start, my focus is on the acquisition of political power. You know, I see both economic gain and the acquisition of political power to be one and the same. Primarily because my concern, in the name of our organization, the Citizens Against Recidivism, is about the notion of citizenship. What does that mean? And I think that if one cannot fully engage in the governance of their own affairs, then they will never be able to gain the economic equality that's needed for, I guess, you know, in terms of what we're talking about. So that would be my short answer on that.
And I guess I would say, you know, the foundational basis of the concept of reparations, you know, and how it has been applied for other groups in the past, historically, in this country and others. that people of African descent, certainly descendants of people who are enslaved, absolutely, by any measure, would absolutely be entitled to reparations in this country. The question is the political feasibility and viability of it, and how do you actually achieve that? But the premise of reparations, that it is in repayment for wrongs done, and how that is all established and set up, overwhelmingly, everything that has been experienced, would qualify for that.
And I would simply add to what has just been said, that in defending the notion of reparations as a remedy for the theft, right, of black resources, of black labor, right, of the black capacity, of black people's capacity to generate wealth, we ought not in any way to be deterred or dissuaded by the argument that is often trotted out, that by demanding reparations today as the descendants of Africans who were enslaved in this country, we are somehow imposing an injustice on the innocent descendants of people who either did not own slaves or who were themselves victims of the economic injustice that American capitalism was in fact designed to be, not only for people of color, but for all poor and working class people. Clearly, that argument is, to me, a smokescreen, which is held up to obscure the essential fact that the institution of prison slavery and the kind of work that our young black men and women do when they are forced into street encounters with the police. Taking a beating, that's an extraction of physical capability, capacity that could be put to work if we educated our young people and gave them the ability to participate meaningfully in the economy. So I think we need a large vision of all the many ways in which value is extracted from the bodies of black people today, and we need to connect that, to slavery, to Jim Crow, peonage, sharecropping, chain gangs, all the things that follow in apostolic succession from slavery, because the history of slavery as an economic system in this country is not yet finished, right? That insight of Frederick Douglass about slavery changing the name is absolutely crucial for us to hold on to. So we're not just demanding reparations for thefts which took place 400 years ago. We're demanding reparations for thefts that took place yesterday and continue today.
Okay, we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. There's a mic down here and there's a mic over there if you want to.
I'm wondering, if we go to all this trouble to change the 13th Amendment, why don't we go to do what Canada did and incorporate the International Declaration of Human Rights into the Constitution as the fundamental law to judge all of our institutions?
Okay, well,
The Constitution Scott.
I was going to toss that to Kendall, but he ran out of here. So,
He's the expert.
sorry about that, sir.
That's a good question.
Go ahead.
So thank you very much. I learned a lot in a hurry today and really appreciated it. What I didn't quite understand is the connection of changing the Constitution to changing the social injustices that are so central here. I think it puts a lot of faith in the words of the Constitution, how courts will interpret them, and what will follow if that success occurs. So I'm just wondering how people are thinking about the mechanism by which trying to change the Constitution will will further the social justice goals that are here? Is it because it allows lawsuits? Is it because the process mobilizes public opinion, or why is it about constitutional change?
First, I think it starts with education. One of the things we wanted to point out is that you realize when the Constitution was written, the majority of the people who wrote the Constitution were slaveholders, okay? And the language that we were referencing from Thomas Jefferson, who probably had the largest opinion with regards to this, is the same language that was used by the framers of the 13th Amendment, okay? And throughout that part of history, and even after that, the issue became, how do you control this population after emancipation? So I think it has to deal with education. You know, whatever kind of mechanism we may use, I think right now, you know, that people think, well, it's too difficult. I've heard history professors say, well, we mess with that, you know, we're going to start something else. Well, most of them have probably never been to prison, right, and don't realize that. So I think that this is an issue that, you know, in, was it 1867, I believe, in Sugar Land, that you had slaves. That's when they first found out that they were emancipated. Okay, when the 13th Amendment was celebrated in 2015, there was never any mention of the exception clause. And this was President Obama that was celebrating it, right? So I think it's about education, educating the population about that the document that we hold so dearly was created for, you know, basically was a business contract between a bunch of guys who owned slaves. You know, so that's one of the ways that I think it's important in terms of dealing with education. And the gentleman up here had a question related to the, what was that you said, the Canadian?
Yeah, I mean, Canada incorporated the International Declaration of Human Rights into its fundamental law. And I'm just wondering if we're going to the trouble to change the 13th Amendment, whether we shouldn't try and do that also.
Well, that's the problem with social movements. You know, a social movement, in order to be successful, I think has to identify one or two very specific and targeted goals, develop a timeline by which it wants to achieve those goals, and have, as Flores would say, some measurables for assessing whether the campaign has been a success. I'm as open as anybody in the room to the notion that our domestic constitution ought to incorporate fully the full panoply of not just political and civil, but economic and social rights that are in some of the great international human rights instruments. As a practical matter, however, I know that that's not likely to happen. And I know, too, you were referencing this obliquely, there's a lot of anxiety in this country about what it would mean in this moment of hyperpolarization to seek a change in any provision of the Constitution. We might, given where we are as a country right now, lose the First Amendment. We might lose birthright citizenship. There are real risks. But I'm a why we can't wait guy on this. Because I think the urgency of addressing this injustice of prison slavery more than warrants the risk. But I think that balancing that risk requires that we undertake a targeted movement in which we are clear about the limited constitutional change that we're seeking, although I think it will be much more transformative than I took the question that was being asked to be. Because the Constitution is not just a legal document. The Constitution actually is a charter, not just of government, but of meaning in this country. It has symbolic, cultural, social, economic significance, which is much, much, much broader than the words that are on the parchment page or the law that we learn and teach in law school. It constitutes us as a people. And that's why a constitution which allows some of our people to be enslaved because they've committed crimes is so unjust and demands change.
And see, one of the things that I want to make mention of in reference to the second question was that, there are some things along the way that are hoped to be achieved, or at least, have some discussion on. And as we begin to understand the foundation upon which the system was constructed, and we talk about notions of social construction, this is why I favored Fred, because it was the idea that he began to ask questions about the situation that had been constructed and that formed his status. And there was, I believe, in following his questioning that, efforts to deconstruct what had been constructed around him. And so part of, I think, the conversation will lead to notions, or my hope is, deconstructing race, as it has been, socially constructed to maintain a division among basically people of color and people of little economic means. So there's a lot of the notions of citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen? Because when the Constitution and this law was basically constructed, it did not include the people that we are talking about in the conversation, or conceptualize them as citizens. And so there's a lot, for me, along the way, that I think would facilitate a change in how we think about our present situation on the way to deconstructing the system as we currently know it.
Hi, everybody. My name is Gwen Goodwin, and I'm so thrilled to have heard this panel today. Flores, I heard you at the Democratic Club the other night, and I was glad you came and spoke. I'm a person who's run for city council a couple of times and be running again, but I'm also a member of the new Black Abolitionist movement, and working with Lynn Stewart's husband, Ralph Pointer, on trying to free our political prisoners. So I'm so thrilled to hear all of this discussion. The only thing that was very troubling to me is that when I looked up at the slideshow and I saw on the top corporations circled, and I have to say that they are the root, to me, of all of these problems. It is the corporations who benefit from free slave laborers in the prisons. So I don't look ever at corporations to fix problems. I live in East Harlem, and I've lived there for years. And I always told the people in our community, do not go to them and ask them to do public partnership with you, because you will be beholden to them. And we are beholden to them. And that is why we have charter schools now. And that is why they are in our schools with their lunches, with their soda, with their poison. So I pretty much believe that our government, we the people, can handle this without them getting involved, because it seems to me they are the benefiters of all of this slave labor. And that until we make our government by the people, for the people, and not about the money, we're not going to see the changes that really need to happen. I just wanted to add that to the conversation. Thank you.
All right. Okay, my name is Charles Heller. I'm talking about, you're looking at the amendments, and you're looking at the Constitution of the United States. We have a Constitution of the United States, but then we have 50 states that have their own, everyone has their own set of rules and regulations. So to get it passed through every single one, that's a start, but you have to start somewhere, but you have to get into each state. Number two, mass incarceration, just like what she was talking about. What is that? That's an industry. That is a huge, huge industry. So if you're going to go back 40 years, like what you're saying, so 40 years ago in New York, or 50 years ago in certain states, how many people of color worked in the prison system? Almost zero. You had German, Irish, whoever you had that were working it in the mid-states. Now you look, there's a migration of Black and Hispanic coming to these prisons and working. So all it is, it's an industry. It's industry, and it keeps people in the areas. They're putting up motels, hotels, people coming in. It's all an industry. It's all an industry on the incarceration of the people, and that's what it is. That's all I'm saying. That's all.
Are we taking multiple questions? Yeah, hi, my name is Dizzy, and I'm with the Revolution Club in New York City. And yeah, right on. And I just wanted to say, look, the point that you made about the Frederick Douglass thing is important for us to keep in mind, right? About slavery wearing new skins. And I thought it was a very important point that was being made, that exploitation and oppression and slavery will always take on different and new incarnations under this system, right? And so, like, the lesson that I'm drawing from that is quite simple, right? That reforms under this system are actually always partial and always under attack, right? So in order to go at actually abolishing in any meaningful way, to actually approach abolishing white supremacy, means that you have to go up against and tear at that blood-soaked fabric that this country, it's capitalist, imperialist America is actually woven from, right? But if we're fighting for reforms, if we're fighting to make amendments to that slave owner's constitution, then there's a contradiction because you're trying to weave patches into that same fabric. And so my question is, well, first of all, I think anything short of revolution is actually bullshit, and we need to overthrow the system of capitalism, imperialism at the soonest possible time, right? And so my question to you is, will you get with revolution? And look, we got to scrap that slave owner's constitution, and we have a constitution. I want to know if you guys will look into this. This is the Constitution for the New Socialist Republic in North America that was authored by the most radical revolutionary on the planet, Bob Avakian. And I want to put that challenge forward to you, but also, say, will you get into this and look into this? There's a whole radical way that the world could be.
Let me just say this. No, you don't have to stay there because I don't want you to respond, right? There was a revolution in this country. I actually fought in it. Okay, so you should read my book, Will You Die With Me? My Life in the Black Panther Party, okay? If you're serious, okay, you have to be serious about risking your life and being willing to kill, okay? I don't think the population ever got to that point because the education was basically supplanted. I mean, when Sheena was talking about literacy, I remember during our political education classes, you had guys who were gunfighters, right? They could barely read, right? The type of ideology that we were trying to instill in the population. Okay, now that was in the 60s, 70s, And so I'm just saying, I think you're asking a lot when you talk about getting down, right? Yeah, well, okay, I got down, I got shot, I wound up in prison, I was a fugitive for 3 years, okay? I realized that the best way for me to be effective was to get my education, get back into the system, and I believe I'm a little more effective now, even than then, okay?
I just want to say a word. Teaching young black and brown kids who do not know how to read is a revolutionary practice.
Hi. I have a more specific historian's question. I snuck out from dissertation writing this afternoon to both wish Professor Thomas a happy birthday, and also because what I'm working on right now is actually the 13th Amendment. I was a journalist. I worked in Ferguson during Black Lives Matter height of stuff going on. And the question that I'm dealing with right now is sort of how and why did Ferguson and Black Lives Matter happen in the state of Missouri? What is it about the state of Missouri? And so one of the things I've super been interested in is Senator Henderson, of whom I've been able to find out very little information. And I do know that he did not believe the 13th was granting equality. He was a pretty ardent white supremacist. He did not think that this was going to create equality. Probably would have been horrified by the 14th and 15th Amendments. But the question I have not been able to find out, other than that he cribbed Thomas Jefferson, did he have a particular stance on the exceptions clause? And was that something that he consciously had in mind was going to do what we've now seen it's done? I haven't been able to find anything out of that. And I just wondered if anyone had, or if you had any other information about him that you thought was interesting.
Yeah. I mean, they went to the Library of Congress to find the information. Okay. Senator Sumner had another amendment that had no exception clause. All right. So they pretty much ran him out the room. Okay, because one of the things I think that by looking at history's text and looking at the language that Thomas Jefferson used and that many of them used, the issue with the exception clause was controlling black bodies after emancipation. And we could talk later about Henderson. And there's a reading list in the back of the program, so you can see there's quite a few sources you can check.
Thank you, Stephen.
So we got, one more?
Before, last night we moved a couple of formerly incarcerated individuals that just came on. I would love to hear what they think on there. Since we're talking about slavery.
I think we should be clear about the differences in the room, because look, we're talking about there's a genocide that's happening. And what you all are putting forward is that somehow, if we rely on the same system, which for over 400 years has kept on responding with this repression, with this white supremacy, then we're gonna stop this. So my question is, I'm also someone who would advocate for revolution, and people should get into Bob Avakian. We're making revolution right now. So this isn't it's happening tomorrow or something like that. So my question is, why is it that you all see it more important to talk about how we can keep the order of America and this oppressive system rather than talk about the radical revolution that is needed to end this capitalist imperialist system?
Different conversation with different people.
Well, I don't think that's the conversation we were having. I mean, clearly you came to this event with a question that you wanted to put to the people in the room because you are an acolyte or a disciple, I don't know what the word is, of Bob Avakian. No. Look, you aren't standing at the mic, actually, so you should be quiet. And so, for me, it's not a question of using existing constitutional law or political forms for changing the constitutional system as an end in itself. I said that quite clearly in my remarks, and I don't think anybody on this panel is invested in constitutional change as the end-all and be-all of what I explicitly said was a social movement to abolish the prison industrial complex. Now, you may not think that's a revolutionary project, but I think, in fact, that there are many Americans in this country who do think it's a revolutionary project and will fight with all their might to resist any change in the status quo. So we are operating from different understandings of what constitutes a revolutionary political practice and whether part of a defensible radical black politics, a radical black politics, can focus on tactical engagements with the state using actually existing tools to dismantle the structure. And that's a difference of political opinion. But the notion that it's not revolutionary, I'm not going to let you beat me up with this "you're not revolutionary" attack.
Come on, let's be honest. What are you saying? You're talking about...
Can we hear from some brothers who are formerly incarcerated? Thank you for deferring to them.
Hello, my name is Robert Wright. I'm from the Center for Justice, formerly incarcerated. Next month will be a year I've been home. Thank you. What I think needs to be addressed and how this changing of the 13th Amendment will impact directly the judicial system, which incarcerates millions of people of color. Simply by what allows, as you spoke to, an economic impact to corporations, well, we have to get that, we have to stop that. One way you stop that is by not allowing inmates these free labor of making 17 cents a day for a $50,000 a year job. What allows this to happen is that slavery cause, right? So now if we get this change, a direct ripple effect is that it opens up litigation for the millions of those incarcerated to demand a free minimum wage. That devastates the economic impact of the prison. Corporations will pull out, prisons will close. And if you don't think this is actual fact, well, look at what's going on in Seattle, where detained non-citizens have the right, class action lawsuit, to demand a minimum wage. That changes everything. Okay? This is what happens when, this is the ripple effect. These are the things that change. Now what happens as a result, it strengthens all our prison activism or prison reform or abolitionists, because now the judicial system has to take into account, well, what are the alternatives now into incarceration? So all these things that we sit around our round tables and around the country that I have the privilege of going with people who are incarcerated and seeing these different ideas of things like restorative justice, things like that. Now, these politicians, they have to listen. Now it's beneficial to listen to you. And this is how a revolution is fought now. Okay? Listen, I done been on both sides. Okay? I served 16 years at 18 years old. So I know about picking up a gun. I know about going to the other side, to the extreme, but what I was blessed to have is they gave me an education while I was incarcerated. I said, you gonna educate me? You gonna leave? I'm gonna walk out here with a bachelor's degree? Me? Revolutionary, right? This is how it's fought now. It's fought through information, lifting our people, educating our people. That's how we win. I don't want to hold up the mic too long, but thank y'all. Appreciate y'all. Thank you, bro.
Thank you, Rob. How you doing, Mr. Flores? Hello, everybody. My name is Ivan. I also work for the Center for Justice along with Rob. I'm formerly incarcerated as well. I just been home about 7 months now. I had a question, but someone else asked it, but I just want to make a statement. You know, I look at the young people when they come with all this energy and all this fervor, right? Let's hit the streets, let's go, and I'm feeling that. But just remember that no one form of resistance or revolution is mutually exclusive, right? You don't, just because you do it one way doesn't necessarily mean that another way is not just as good or as effective, you know? So, I mean, the fact that we have this many black and brown people at an elite institution listening and talking about this is a form of revolution in itself, right? And that we have white folks sitting here with us, listening and participating and agreeing and we're communicating, that's a form of revolution, you know? So, I mean, you look at the TV every time they show images of black and brown people, they show the dumbest, they show the dumbest people on the planet, right? The dumbest black and brown people on the planet for a reason. So the fact that, you know, that we're sitting here and we're educating ourselves and we're committing to a cause, regardless of the vehicle that we use to make our statement or to get our message across, right? Or how we do it, right? It's all revolution. So don't think that one way, because, you know, a lot of us older folks, you know, we sort of, you know, calm down when we get a little older, and we, you know, it's kind of hard to hit the streets, you know, but we still have that fire, you know, we still have the fire, but we just do it in a different way, man. So just for the young folks, don't think that we're here.
Flores.
I just want to can I just add to that point? And I love Columbia. I was a student here for many years. But just to crystallize that point, the war is fought on many fronts. And there's no utility in fighting another group that's trying to advance a cause that you believe in. It's a distraction. There's no value in that. So if you've chosen your lane and you're fighting on your front, fight your front. But when you pivot and attack others that are also fighting, it takes energy and resource out of what you're trying to do. So there's a lot of ways to get at this, and do what you think you need to do.
Go ahead, sister. This is the last question.
Hi, I'm so grateful to be here, and you guys are absolutely phenomenal. And thank you for fighting literacy, because you're right. If we don't learn civics, if we don't learn to read, we're already behind the ball. I'm formerly incarcerated. I was in prison at 17, Valley State Prison for Women in Chowchilla, California. I absolutely know what slave labor is. I couldn't get a job at 17 unless I had my mother's signature, but I went to California prison and they worked me from day to night. And it was funny because you said 15 cents. I went to prison in '97 and I made 8 cents an hour. And the governor was Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he came to visit, and it was funny because I was mowing the lawn from 4:30 a.m. after count time until my feet used to bleed. And he patted me on my back and said, "Good job." I said, "Oh my God, this is really a slave master and a real whip." Because I'm somebody's child, mowing a football field state lawn every day with calluses and blood on my feet. I really do know what slaves feel like. And when I got out, I'm totally, whatever I can do to help this movement, please somebody call me. Because when I got out of prison and got off parole, I went to the employment agency, and I actually filed a grievance, and it was for slave labor. And they laughed, and they were like, "We don't owe you." I said, "I worked for 5.5 years underage as you used me. No, you do owe me." And so I definitely believe this is the battle. Because if we can impact the 13th Amendment, we can stop child slavery. And he's right. The gentleman had just said, because I'm going to go back and write the Department of Labor. Please give me what you owe me for 5.5 years of slavery. Absolutely, you are right. And absolutely, this movement is absolutely right. So thank you, guys.
No more questions. No more questions. Okay, we're gonna wind it up.
Long way to be here.
Okay.
Since I came a long way to be here, and also when I say a long way, I spent 30 years and 9 months in prison, right? Now let me just tell you something. My name is Davies Shark, right? Known as DB Shark, the celebrity favorite. Okay. In 1 year, the second title. I was speaking to Governor Phil Murphy and also de Blasio about 2 weeks ago about what's going on right now. And I told him that you need people in your cabinet that have experience, living experience. So while the other guys in prison was lifting weights, getting big, nice and big, I was lifting books, right? When they were in jail, I was in Yale. When they went to prison, I went to Princeton. So I developed social etiquette classes that's being taught right now in the prisons that I left. I developed alternative to violence, to be decision makers, not having others make decisions for you. And in doing so, the importance of reading and picking up a book to travel around the world. So that today I can come here and I can speak to you and I can tell you things about me that you're not going to believe unless I tell you these things. This is change. Because 30 years when I went to prison, the man that's standing here was a whole different person. And the young sister that was up here, and she was, the violence, it's not going to pay. But I don't want to knock her. I just want anyone who feels that way to listen. I've watched several of my friends die who decided to live like that. And they went against the officers and they died in the process. And they're just memories, that's it. I'm still here educating everybody I come in contact with words or by action. So Doctor, and your whole panel, I really appreciate all of y'all. Y'all all have ways, and what you said, Sister was right. Don't knock, if you find one way to do it, don't knock the other person. Learn from them. I learned from everyone here today, even the sisters that won the revolution. It just makes me understand why I can't resort to violence. It's not going to pay. So what I'll say today is, the book is your revolution. Pick up a book, read a book, understand the history of this country, understand your history as an individual, understand your job to your family members, understand your position. And if you see the number 9 on the ground right there, if I stand at one end, it looks like a 6, and I stand at the other end, it's a 9. We could have different opinions, and we could still work together. Thank you.
I really want to thank everybody for coming, and to just let you know that we have your email. We will be following up with you. We are going to be developing a website to lay down the ground rules for our next steps. And right now, you can probably go to the Government Community Affairs website at Columbia University, and you can see some of the things that we're working on and some of the follow-up that you'll be able to participate in.
Now, I wanted to say before we left that I would not be standing here, and certainly might not even be in this room, were it not for my friend and my teacher, Flores Forbes. One of the extraordinary things that the work at Columbia has made possible is for me to understand in a new way that old phrase that Marx once wrote, that the educators must be educated. There's revolutionary learning going on in this room and in the networks that we have created through the Center for Justice, through the Office of Government and Community Affairs, and all around the university. So one of the next things that's going to be happening here, and somebody can fill me in because I'm not going to be able to recall the precise dates, here on the Columbia campus, I believe it's the first weekend in March, is the Beyond the Bars Conference. March 7th and 8th.
7th through the 10th.
7th through the 10th, right, because it's a whole weekend. And I'm sure that some of the same conversations that you have been hearing here, you will hear at the Beyond the Bars Conference, where the special theme this year, I understand, is going to be on the prison industrial complex and women and girls. Is that right? Yes. All right. So we want to see you all there March 7th through 10th here on the Columbia University campus so we can continue this work.